Hello and welcome to Searching for the Question Live. My name is David Orban and I am very happy to have all of you here on the show. Before we start, I want to remind you that even if we are live, you can watch past episodes on YouTube, Facebook, and you can, of course, subscribe to the channel on YouTube to be alerted when we are going to be live and the new episodes are available. We also have a Discord community that you can join in order to continue the conversation around the themes that are quite varied, and there are very stimulating questions that we can also look at greater depth, just discussing them amongst ourselves. And if you like Searching for the Question Live, as well as other content that I produce together with my team, you are welcome to become a supporter on Patreon at patreon.com/David Orban. Today we are going to talk about the issues of how humanity evolves with technology. This is what has been happening for the past 10,000 years and more. And this evolution appears to be accelerating. If 100 or 200 years ago or more, you could live your entire life in an environment that was unchanging, statistically speaking, and generation after generation, that would still be the case, and you could expect your children to spend their lives under the same conditions, constraints, good and bad, as you did, and traditions were rooted in this deep understanding and belief that things would be unchanging forever. Today, that is definitely not true. To the contrary, we are now living under the assumption that things are going to be changing, and changing maybe even faster than we expect. Now, the point, though, is that we all individually, and also probably as a species and as a society, have a limit to our adaptability. And as a consequence, we have to understand how these limits are, what they are, and how we can overcome them if possible. And transhumanism is indeed the philosophy, the approach that asks itself these questions. What are these limits? How can we overcome these limits? And that is what we are going to be talking about with Stefan, who I welcome. Thank you very much for being on the show with us today, Stefan.
Many thanks, David, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure for me.
And we are also going to talk about what is posthumanism. I have no idea. So we will discuss issues that have very important formal academic roots in philosophy, but also issues that have tremendously important existential implications for everybody on the planet. So, Stefan, what I like to do with my guests as we start is, first of all, to ask them how they are, because it is not at all a given in today's world. You are alive. That's one brownie point. And where are you? How have you been these past 3-4 months?
I'm fine. I'm in a privileged position here. I'm not constrained to go out. I can teach from my home, which is in Rome, and so this is quite a privileged place to be. And from here, I've been doing my remote learning, my remote teaching sessions. I've had exchanges with my students, and so this is a really good place to be. And I'm aware that it's a privileged place to be. And in addition, Rome is even possible when you have to stay at home because the climate is amazing here.
And Rome is a beautiful city. If some of our viewers have the opportunity in the future when we can travel again to go and visit Rome and they haven't been, it is truly one of the places that you must see in the world. So you are a member of the faculty at John Cabot University, which is itself in a amazing part of Rome, in Trastevere, and close to the river, but also with nice gardens in an old building. How long have you been associated with the university?
So I've moved here at the beginning of 2016. I'm sort of tenured faculty member of John Cabot University. It's an amazing location. It's a wonderful university, which is right at the core of Rome. Rome is indeed probably the most beautiful city in the world. And Trastevere is the best part of it. That's where you go out. That's where you can sit outside, socialize with your friends, eat delicious meals, and then the university is hosted in a beautiful building of the 12th century, and right sort of a kilometer away from the Vatican, right in the center. And so we can sit in normal circumstances. You can sit on a roof terrace and discuss some of the most pressing issues of our times here. Because here, basically, what I'm doing is I'm promoting the reflections on the impact of emerging technologies.
And the university is accredited, of course, and it is giving both undergraduate and graduate courses.
Exactly, it's giving undergraduate and graduate courses. It's US accredited, and also in Italy, and but it's a US American university. So we've got, a third of the students normally come from the United States. The third of the students come from Italy, and the rest comes from the rest of the world, from Saudi Arabia, Ukraine, Russia, Korea. And so it's a wonderful...
How many students in the average year?
Oh, we've got 1,500 students. So it's a really small place, and the classes are also quite small. They are limited to 25 students. In the average, we've got normally like 15 students per class. So it's a very intimate exchange between students and professors. One can get to know each other and promote them on the way towards becoming scholars, or on which other way they want to work on.
And how did you originally get in touch with the university? You are originally from Germany, right?
I'm originally from Germany.
Were you a philosopher already when you were young?
I've started to become a philosopher already sort of before my teens.
Okay. Your parents hoped that it would change. It would be only like an adolescent twist, and
I
you
will
would
grow out of it. Well, this is what they hoped for. No, but I really must say they did support me on my way, and I'm very grateful for that. But obviously, I was very good in school in mathematics and physics. These were my main subjects. And my original plan was to study mathematics. And so this is also partly what they've been hoping for. And then suddenly I realized, but the real questions are the ones which are being dealt with in philosophy. These are the ones which we need to tackle. And mathematics is actually the best possible preparation for thinking about philosophical issues. Without a proper preparation in like logical thinking, mathematical thinking, I don't think you can do philosophy in the right kind of manner.
And would 90% of the philosophers that philosophers admire be discarded by that observation?
Well, I can tell you that most students actually drop out. They expect to study philosophy, sit around, think profound thoughts, have a cup of coffee, have some drinks, and talk about meaningful issues. But this is not really what philosophy is like in the end. I mean, we do talk about these things, but it is really about extremely rigorous way of thinking about the most profound issues. because philosophers, as I think, are the sort of the stuntmen for the tricky questions which come up in all the sciences. But that's why the dropout rate in philosophy is 90%, which is higher than in any other subject.
And isn't it paradoxical that people who should be clearly thinking are unable to communicate what their subject is about, to the degree that those who are candidates to follow their footsteps leave the field because they didn't really understand what they were going to do?
Yeah, this is very true. And actually, in most of the disciplines, it's only like the very best people who really understand the challenging philosophical issues underlying their own fields, and then sort of there is an exchange between the leading scientists, leading chemists, leading physicists in all the fields with philosophers, and the philosophers even manage, if they are good, they manage to straighten out, help them to think more clearly about what they're doing in their own field. So a good philosopher also has to be proficient in specific disciplines. I mean, I've been working, for example, in a medical department for a couple of years, and so I was in close contact with physicians. I was the only philosopher among 20 physicians in the department. And so I helped them to get their thinking right, and they supported me in getting a better understanding how genome editing works, what goes on when we implant sort of deep brain stimulation. And so this is a very fruitful way of doing philosophy and having exchanges. And I think that's the only proper way of also how you can think properly, do proper philosophy yourself, and not just do the history of philosophy. Because that's not what I've studied philosophy for, why I became a philosopher, because I really want to deal with, I'm perplexed by the world. Why is there something rather than nothing? And so I really want to engage with these questions. And so
one of my favorite philosophers is Daniel Dennett.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons is because he's able to communicate so clearly and never hides behind complex terminology or pretend that you can only talk about certain subject if you are able to read Kant in the original German. One of his books, one of his more recent books, is entitled Intuition, Pumps, and Other Tools for Thinking. And the book opens with such an amazing statement. He says, philosophy evolves as a subject. We built better tools for thinking over the course of the centuries and the millennia. And if you become familiar with the tools that I am illustrating in this book, you will be a better philosopher than Socrates or Aristotle or Plato. And that is an astonishing starting point that is just exhilarating from my point of view. I don't know if you share it, but an even, I think, more provocative question. If philosophy is such an important underpinning across many scientific disciplines, can and should philosophy aim to be a science too? And if it may become one, how will it measure its own progress? How will it be tested in an epistemologically sound manner?
Yeah. Let me first answer sort of your first comment. I think that's been a very important one, what you said about the clarity. There's a division in the field of philosophy. There are many different philosophical approaches. And I think clarity is enormously important. The clearer you are, the better. If you cannot clear about what you want to say, you're not a good philosopher. But there are different traditions in philosophy who do not subscribe to that understanding. I know even in the exchange of articles, I've been criticized for being so clear. Someone wrote, he's so clear, he cannot be profound. I strongly disagree with that understanding of philosophy. So yeah, so I share your understanding, whatever can be said. So if it can be said, if you properly understood it, then it can be said clearly. But I disagree actually that philosophy is a science.
I didn't say that it was. The question was, should it aim to be?
Okay, should it? I don't even think it should aim to be a science, but it should be. It's like, you know, the stuntman in the tricky cases. It's sort of where the empirical sciences stop. Their reflections, their scientific endeavors are based on a philosophical paradigm, and whether that paradigm is true or false cannot be verified or falsified by means of empirical questions. So whether you analyze the humans by means of a immaterial soul, or whether that's part of the empirical world, there is not an empirical verification or falsification of that. However, so the underlying paradigm is what we reflect upon. So that's why I don't think we should aim for being a science. However, we should aim for being in close contact with the sciences. So a good philosopher has to understand what's going on in the sciences. The latest finding in biotechnology, in AI technology, has to understand cryptocurrencies if they want to talk about it. But that doesn't mean philosophy itself should aim to be a science.
I will think about it, and I don't want to get stuck on this point, which we could run the risk of doing. There are certain disciplines that can be recursively applied to themselves. So, for example, the study of mathematics is mathematical. And mathematical tools can be developed in order to categorize, for example, different approaches. Meta-mathematics is mathematics. Now, as I go about looking at certain philosophies and compare philosophical thought through time, for example, to establish whether certain philosophers even deserve to be studied, unless I'm a historian of philosophy, because maybe their usefulness has passed and our current tool set simply discarded the approaches that they were practicing. That kind of approach is probably appropriately philosophical by itself, but is it admissible for philosophy to pretend to be able to say something about every possible science without being sufficiently scientific? And I am struggling with that a little bit. I am sufficiently attached to the wonderful efficiency of the scientific method to allow another discipline to have things to say about all sciences without passing through the requirements and the proofs that the scientific method would impose, right? Mm-hmm. So we will leave that for another for the next conversation we will have. Now,
just one comment, sort of, in order to show that one must distinguish also between sort of ontological reflections and reflections on values, on morals.
Okay. So what is an ontological reflection?
So ontological would be, it's a reflection on what there is, on whether we are confronted with, what a table is, what the world is, whether we can meaningfully talk about the world. That's a different question to ethical ones, where we talk about values, norms, what should be the case. And just to show that at least the ethical reflections now, they cannot be investigated by means of empirically or scientific inquiries. You don't see values, you don't see norms. So here it's a matter of which ontological status do these values and norms have, and that's really tricky, because in a way, you would want to say if someone murders an innocent child, that is an evil action. But where do you get this evil from? Which grounding do you have for that? And if it's not,
we'll go back.
And so these are just to show the relevance.
We will, but we will go back to that point within the hour we or three. I don't know how much time we will spend together, but today. But what I want to start now exploring is whether you or how you approach the opening remark that I exposed about the interaction between humanity and technology. And why is it, evidently it is from your point of view, because a lot of your work is around that, why is it useful to introduce beyond transhumanism this additional term of posthumanism, and how the two relate to each other?
So it was not just me who introduced the term posthumanism. Both transhumanism and posthumanism were coined a long time ago. I mean, transhumanism was coined in 1951 by Julian Huxley. Posthumanism is a term which was coined at the end of the 70s. The traditions are radically separate. Transhumanism has to do with evolutionary thinking, has to do with reflections on the impact of emerging technologies, a lot of taking a normative stance, but it's very much related to evolutionary thinking. It's an affirmation. By using technologies, our lives will get better. Posthumanism, on the other hand, has a different cultural background. It comes from postmodern thinking. It comes from French, German philosophy. And here it is more of a transcending of, a twisting of traditional humanism. It's more a reflection of on the very foundations of who we are as human beings. And I think both of these approaches are very important. I think both of these approaches have something extremely important to contribute to philosophy. And both of these approaches represent a paradigm shift away from the origins or what has been taken for granted in philosophical circles for 2,000 years. And so it's really a paradigm shifting way of thinking, and it breaks away with the very foundations of our Western way of thinking. And that's why, for example, someone like Francis Fukuyama, this political scientist in the US, has referred to transhumanism as the world's most dangerous idea, because everything we have taken for granted, most of the leading philosophers in the Western tradition have taken for granted, is being undermined both by transhumanism as well as by posthumanism. But both of these traditions have a different focus.
Are you happy with the Wikipedia article on posthumanism? And if not, did you try and straighten it out?
I did not try and straighten it out, but it has some very good aspects. I think it has improved quite a bit in recent times, but in recent years, some very good academic work has been done both in the field of post as well as transhumanism, and
including I would like to say, because you are too modest to do so, thanks to your efforts, because you founded and are the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Posthuman Studies, and your esteemed editorial board certainly was able to shepherd a lot of interesting contributions over the years in this journal, right?
Many thanks. Yeah, you're very kind. Yes, I've been trying to promote the field of studies in academia. I mean, traditionally, sort of the reflection about the impact of emerging technologies has been looked down upon in philosophical circles. So they were thinking it's just a bunch of young people who've been sitting in front of the computer too long.
What percentage of philosophers, and more in general in social studies, are proud of their technological ignorance?
The percentage is quite high, I would say.
Isn't it? Still, right? And that is just a disgrace.
It is actually, and a lot of philosophy which has been done it's sort of a history of philosophy. I mean, there are some benefits in history of philosophy and so on, but not many people, not many philosophers dare to take a stance. They dare to actually get confronted with the latest issues and then develop philosophical thinking further. And I remember sort of the responses I got when I was invited as a keynote speaker on technology and art. I was the only one talking about contemporary art, about bio art, about the brain-computer interfaces, about animals in art. But everyone else was talking about the use of technology in Renaissance prints. Why? Because they didn't think one can study anything which occurs right now, which has occurred in the past 50 years. Everything must have passed a long time. And yeah, so there's a strong hesitation to deal with all these, with the latest developments, because they don't know how to they feel they cannot take a reliable perspective on that issues. But I think that's what philosophy, good philosophy is, and how it ought to be done. Yeah, you've just shown some amazing videos. Earlier on, one of the sculptures, a living sculpture by Eduardo Kach. He's the one who coined the term bioart, and he's a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Posthuman Studies.
Tell us, what are we seeing here, because it's quite crazy too.
Let me talk about this because the fluorescent rabbit, whom you've just shown at the beginning, is sort of a transgenic rabbit. It's a genetically modified rabbit which glows green in the dark. So it's not an object, it's not a thing, but it's a living animal which was genetically altered, and which now counts as a work of bioart, which now counts as a work of art. And that radically, obviously, changes our understanding of what a work of art should be. So it's no longer just a painting, it's no longer just a material thing, an object, but now we've got living entities which have been biotechnologically, in that case, altered, who turn into works of art. And they die eventually, and actually the rabbit has died, and you wonder whether the process of decay is still part of the process of being a work of art. So the emerging technologies do not only have an impact on, they have an impact on all aspects of our life world, also on the realm of arts, and that's what I think we need to reflect upon as philosophers. That's what I'm doing.
One important component in all of this is that the speed of change is such that traditional sedate methods relying on elderly members of our society, having grown accustomed to certain things as they are digested in the fabric of our everyday life, and then pronouncing what the degree of usefulness or value of that new component in society is, cannot do their work anymore, because things change too fast, then we die. That was actually not that exact wording, but a similar wording was an astonishing slide that Bra Pettis, who then went on to found the 3D printer company. I don't remember even the name of the 3D printer company. It used to be the leading consumer 3D printing company. Bra Pettis gave a talk at the Berlin Chaos Computer Club conference, and that was it. Things change too fast, then we can die. So given that old methodology is not applicable anymore, the responsibility of policymakers who are in total despair and would like to rely on various kinds of advisors who most commonly come from industry, and they represent a very narrow set of interests. But what probably you would like, on the shoulders of philosophers, is a huge responsibility, because you have to rapidly come up with the best possible way to interpret the implications of certain technologies while we are already implementing and sending them out in the world.
Yeah, you're right. That's a very important point, actually, and it goes deeper. You can see sort of the philosophical developments in the past 2,000 years, and we don't even realize that the relicts of that thinking are still culturally dominant. Sort of, they represent the legal framework on which our actions are based, on which we are judged as human beings. For example, I just want to represent one example. Our self-understanding as human beings. The German foundational law is a very good example, but it applies to most constitutions in the world. Only humans possess dignity. Animals are legally supposed to be treated like objects. There's still sort of that's the categorical distinction between humans and the rest of the natural world. And this is absurd. I mean, this is a result of the reflections which have taken for granted in philosophical circumstances. That is basically an implication of what Plato, Descartes, Kant affirmed, but it's still legally valid. In most constitutions in the world, only humans possess the divine spark, and therefore ought to be treated with dignity, possess personhood. Animals are supposed to be classified as things, and obviously, plants and the rest of the world. And that has enormous implications concerning what kind of research we are allowed to do. How we are supposed to ethically maybe modify human beings, apply genome editing, CRISPR-Cas9 to humans. And so, it's really a change on a very fundamental philosophical level, which is taking place as a consequence of sort of the revised understanding of us as human beings, which took place with evolutionary thinking, with Darwin, and sort of transhumanism is an outgrowth of the Darwinian paradigm shift. And I think sort of on a cultural level, on a legal level, the entire implications have not yet been realized.
My favorite example of what you just mentioned is how the Aristotelian distinction between humanities and practical occupations, where the first are believed to be superior and the second inferior, is still dominating both our education, the perception of the value of professions and occupations, and it is very, very detrimental when so much of our well-being is derived from our ability to understand and apply knowledge in the world for practical means, rather than abstract thinking, disjointed by their applications. And if philosophy is recognizing this responsibility, then philosophy should both aim to understand technology very deeply, because of how much an increasing percentage of our world is defined by technology and its evolution, but also philosophy should equip itself with technology, just as we have been, enhancing our vision through telescopes and microscopes, or just, viewing glasses if we are myopic. Philosophy may be suffering from myopia if it is not using technology at its fullest.
Exactly. That applies, I mean, both to the use of technology, to making yourself familiar with technology. I mean, how should you be able to say something sensible about genome editing without knowing what's actually going on, without having been in a lab and someone has shown you sort of the procedures? The same applies obviously to the digital technologies as well. But in the end, also it comes down to sort of to the philosophical question on how we see ourselves and what is reason. What does reason stand for? And the traditional answer was reason is sort of, it comes from outside. It's the divine immaterial spark to which our material body gets connected. And with these posthuman philosophies, with these new approaches, that understanding of reason gets altered. And nowadays it's being more realized that we've always been technologically altered beings. We've always been, I like to stress, we've always been cyborgs. We've always been cybernetic organisms. The cybernetic comes from Kubernetes, which means the helmsman, the steersperson of a ship. So we've always been altered, steered organisms. And sort of our parents teaching us language, that's the first upgrade which we get as human beings. We get upgraded by means of language. It doesn't come from outer space. It doesn't come from an immaterial world, but that's the first kind of technological alteration which we receive. And the entire, education process is a further modification process. And if we understand that, then we see the benefits also which have to do with technologies on the one hand. On the other hand, we also recognize that technologies are not something external to us, are not something aliens, but are something which, have always helped us to increase the likelihood of us living good lives. And if we understand that, then there's not a good reason to be hostile to the latest technologies. But we need to use them and apply them and integrate them in the curriculum, in the educational curriculum, but also in a legal framework in the appropriate manner. And that's what we need to discuss. Sort of what is the appropriate manner?
Actually, that there are glimpses of this understanding percolating across society is I think quite neatly demonstrated by the fact that there are emerging sections of IT, narrowly looking at it, but more broadly of technologies applied to areas that didn't believe to be technological before. We are talking about fintech, where finance is recognized as a technology and as a consequence aims to take advantage of as much as possible in improving itself through technology. You mentioned cryptocurrencies, for example. In Europe, there is a fantastic piece of legislation, only partially implemented, even though compulsory, that requires all banks to be interoperable so that you are never in a silo, but your money can or should be more freely flowing than before. Another discipline is RegTech, regulatory technology. How can different sets of regulations be compared to each other, and how can best practices from jurisdictions that successfully implemented certain frameworks, for example, regulating biotechnology in Singapore or in the UK, be adopted in other countries that recognize that set of regulations is a firm basis on which to both educate and then innovate without having to reinvent everything from scratch. So I'm definitely looking forward for philosophy to also adopt this stance and become, I don't know whether it's going to be called field tech or whatever it should be, but where technology enhances and allows philosophy to be impactful, because we very, very much need it. An article that you contributed, or maybe it is an interview in a magazine, clearly illustrates this. where you talk about the future of digital surveillance and healthcare, the interaction of big data and privacy. And it's a wonderful article. And one of a more provocative statements that I like to poke people with is, in the future, there will be no company that will be able to afford not to employ a philosopher, because today only the largest pharmaceuticals have bioethics committees, but ethical committees applied to any possible ethical implication of what you do will become as important as having a chief information officer today. There will be the CPO, the chief philosophy officer of these enterprises. And I don't know whether you agree or disagree, but I think that is pretty important. When I meet somebody who is studying philosophy, I'm telling them, wow, that is one of the most sought after professions that is going to be in the future.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's not a surprise that a common friend of ours, I mean, Martine Rothblatt, who's the CEO of a big pharmaceutical company in the US. I mean, she got her PhD in medical ethics, in bioethics. So besides her being trained as a lawyer, she knows how to reflect philosophically on all these issues. And that's partly the reason why, I mean, she's got an understanding of the wider impact of what she's doing with these new technologies. And quite a few actually big companies, as you mentioned, they have employed philosophers in order to get a better understanding of what they can do, also a better understanding on the legal implications. So it's not just it's not just getting understanding concerning how it changes our self-understanding, but also sort of the wider social aspects. And I think in particular, sort of the field of technologies, which I regard as the most promising, they also challenge our self-understanding of who we are as human beings. And they have to do with brain-computer interfaces, sort of with chips wandering into our bodies getting upgraded by means of RFID chips. And this will, from how I see it, this will have some of the most important implications and for the decades to come. Sort of what Elon Musk is doing with Neuralink. That's most fascinating, and I think it will have enormous implication also concerning how we survey our body, how we treat ourselves, whether we can realize something like predictive maintenance on our body. Predictive maintenance is sort of a technological procedure which has been used on airplanes, on machines so far. So you've got sensors in a machine and they tell you, oh, this certain part needs to be fixed. It's still well functioning, but in the next 6 months it needs to be exchanged. And if our bodies receive such an upgrade with chips, we also could apply that predictive maintenance on our health technology, which could have an enormous consequence for the increase of our health span. And that's a goal which is of enormous interest to most people in the world.
You have a book coming out in English translation, originally written in German in December, on transhumanism. What is the message of the book, and why should I read it?
So it presents reasons for how transhumanism represents a paradigm shift in our cultural history. And it also shows why the use of the emerging technologies is not something which leads to only a very stereotypical way of living our lives, only like Superman on Viagra or Wonder Woman on Botox get promoted by means of transhumanism, but actually technology is a means of increasing plurality in the world. And the further aspect, which I think is very important, that the application of technologies doesn't necessarily lead to injustices, doesn't necessarily lead to a further hierarchization of society. Only by applying the new technologies in the appropriate manner, I think this is sustainable and just society can actually be promoted best. So if you want to have an understanding of the history and the past and the past and the present of transhumanism, as well as some of the most important discourses, this is a very good book for you. But I'll also take my stance. I also show sort of central elements of what I stand for in comparison to what other transhumanists affirm.
You have a new fan, Tiago from Brazil, saying hello. And he says, I love transhumanism. It's a very interesting subject. It is, I believe, not only one of the world's most dangerous ideas, or the most dangerous idea, but that is a consequence of its power and of its importance. So first of all, it is a powerful and important idea. And then if it is dangerous, is because maybe you feel threatened, because you feel uncertain in your identity, in your purpose, in your role in this world that is rapidly changing. But
Excellent.
What I hope that the people who feel that they are not up to confronting the implications of the idea of transhumanism come to realize is that we have the power in ourselves to be a protagonist of our lives, regardless of how rapidly the world is changing, and that we don't depend on antiquated reference frames that box us in a certain kind of recognition of who we are and in relationship with others. We can redefine those frameworks. We can break out of the boxes, and the freedom that we acquire as a consequence is exhilarating. It's frightening, of course, just like the roller coaster is frightening and exhilarating, but we want to ride it nonetheless.
Exactly. It's breaking away from all the certainties which we used to have, sort of all the stabilities, our traditional way of conceptualizing the world. So it's a very dynamic worldview. But that is also obviously why it's so extremely frightening to many people. And in particular, actually in Europe, there's an enormous hesitation to embrace these ideas connected to transhumanism. I mean, I've been promoting these ideas now for decades, and in Europe, I'm usually invited to sort of cultural events, social events, less political events. However, I gave talks at I was invited by the Minister of Innovation from Taiwan. I was invited by big political events in South Korea several times, and they asked me for advice. I mean, in Taiwan, it was an event where the former general director of the World Trade Organization participated in, and it was an event on smart cities, and they wanted to listen to a philosopher to provide them with some implication, with some insights.
It is quite painful, and in Europe, as you say, the position is completely the opposite of what is called the Precautionary Principle, that has been actually included in the Lisbon Treaty, which is the equivalent of the European Constitution, even though 600 pages long, and this precautionary principle is almost the guaranteed death of innovation, because it requires you to prove the lack of any danger, lack of every possible damage, and it is ready to give up on all upside if you cannot prove that there is zero downside, which is of course impossible. And I had the privilege of being invited. Maybe they didn't know I was a transhumanist in a European Union or European Commission workshop in Brussels, designing the policy recommendations for the next 30 years of educational policy. And, it was a 3 days workshop, very good and very intense, with maybe 20 people. And I waited and waited and waited. And then I said, so as technology progresses, we can expect, I don't know if in 10 years, I don't know if in 20 years, but guaranteed within 30 years, the widespread availability of cognitive enhancement through technology, which will require completely redesigned relationships between teachers and students and the way of learning and blah, 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 blah. And the representative from Germany had to leave the room because he realized that he wouldn't have the power of restraining himself because he was about to punch me physically. And that was a very clear demonstration of what a huge chasm there is between the reality and how Europe sees itself and its role. And it is not very promising, because once it is in the Constitution, or almost, it is very, very difficult to unseat. Tiago is asking a great question. He's saying, do you believe we should have the right to completely edit our DNA as if we were to become a new species?
Yeah. How should we approach these new questions? We are confronted with an enormous amount of new questions, in particular when it comes to gene editing technologies. So my suggestion is always to find an analogous procedures which we've been confronted with in the past. So with respect to gene editing, it's basically part of our morphological freedom. So as long as we take on our responsibility for ourselves, then, and it doesn't concern or tackle other people, then we should have the right to modify ourselves. It's getting a bit more complicated when it comes to decisions made by parents for their children, because it's here, someone else who it has consequences for someone else. But even in such a relationship, you can see it's a parental duty to educate the child, and education is structurally analogous to parents making genetically modifying the child. In both circumstances, a parent, normally a good parent, is sort of the intention is to increase the likelihood of the child living a good life. And whether you use measures or whether you use genome editing techniques, that's just a matter of the techniques. The goal is the same. When the goal is the same, when the goal is a good one, and when the goal doesn't constitute child abuse, then obviously we should be allowed to use these technologies. And that's there's such a strong hesitation to embrace these technologies. But by comparing these technologies with traditional ones, we can see, we can find a reliable way of how to judge these new technologies. And in that case, I think the principle of morphological freedom, as well as the right of parents of educative freedom, implies that genome editing should be able, parents should have the right to use genome editing techniques on their children if they are reliable and if they are used for good ends, in the same way as we have good educative ends. They are not always good, because obviously the risk is too high, then the application on children, then one needs to be more careful. But if it becomes a reliable technique, and the goal is something which normally also gets promoted by means of education, then it could also turn into the moral duty of the parent to use it on their children. For example, if we manage to, in a reliable way, if we manage to increase the likelihood of the child living 30 years longer in the average, and that's a reliable way of applying, which we can realize by means of CRISPR, then what would you say to a parent who says, I don't want to do this to my child? It would not really be a good parent, no?
But there is a 2,000-year-old book that tells me I shouldn't.
Well, I'm not even sure whether this is the case. I mean, there actually, in that book which you're referring to, there are many passages of people who've lived for 120 years or more, Methuselah even more. So if you look at these passages, then it could even become a religious duty. I mean, so far we've got an average lifespan of 80 years. In the Bible, you find, people having lived 120 years. So even, also for a Christian, it should be an option, maybe even an obligation to promote the lifespan.
My way of looking at this question is a bit simplistic. If you love humanity, then you have a choice of either letting robots colonize the universe, or if you also want humans to take part in the adventure of wonderful exploration that we have ahead of us, then necessarily you will want to have humans well adapted to live on Mars, to live in the asteroid belt, in the moons around Jupiter, or in interstellar space. And the degree of transformation, whether in our body shape, our metabolism, or even in our cognitive processes, as maybe millennia pass before we arrive to the next star system, are going to be required, will represent a beautiful flourishing of different ways of living the human condition. And then it will be up to that new Congress of varied, rich diversity of civilizations to come to an agreement if the word still applies, if it is necessary and useful to call each of the members of these different ways of living humans, or we will come up with another name. Maybe it will be the robots saying, listen, fine, you are our ancestors, we love you unconditionally, but let's come up with a name that is, please, more inclusive. Either you call me human too, regardless of having been born from steel and silicon, or we find a word that enables us to coexist and recognizes our rights, our duties, our aspirations, and dreams collectively. Mm-hmm. And with that view, I think we realize that if we decide not to embrace that variety, we declare humanity dead right there. Exactly. It is game over.
Exactly. And this is sort of part of what I've tried to show earlier on already. It's moving away. Traditionally, it was only humans who possess dignity, only humans who have personhood, only we are special. But now we need to realize, no, actually, that's speciesism. Peter Singer, one of the most famous philosophers alive, that's the word he is using. We attribute a higher moral status to humans just because they are a member of the human species, and not because of some capacities they have. But if animals have the capacities or robots have the capacities, we shouldn't be so speciesist. We should also acknowledge their relevance. And that's moving away, giving a new moral understanding to other entities in the world. But that means I understand sort of knowing the history of these concepts. I understand what an enormous task it is, because it means breaking away from our cultural past of the past 2,000 years. So for many people, they've got an enormous hesitation of taking that step, of acknowledging that, yes, a great ape, a chimpanzee, can also count as a person. And actually in Argentina, it was recently ruled by a court that an orangutan was attributed personhood, and as a consequence, the orangutan had to be freed, had to be liberated from the zoo. But the same obviously applies also to robots. If the robots, and there's there are good reasons for claiming that, if robots have the necessary capacities, we must also acknowledge their moral equality. And so personhood should open up from not just being limited to humans, but also members of other species, of other animals, and as well as to robots. And this will promote a more inclusive society, a more pluralistic society as well.
One of the great promises, in my opinion, of artificial intelligence is to force us in a way that is beyond being accelerated. As part of the group that designed the Singularity University 12 years ago, we are neck deep in exponential technologies, where you have a constant rate of acceleration, designing these curves of technology improving. But more recently, I formulated a paradigm that I call of jolting technologies, where the rate of acceleration itself is increasing. And artificial intelligence is that. Stanford University a year ago published a report where they analyzed the data and said, if Moore's law were acting in 8 years between 2012 and 2020, we would have had a 30-fold increase in the power of AI applications. Instead, what we observe is a 300,000-fold increase. So our expectations based on the traditional exponential paradigm are wrong. Things are changing faster than we realize. That this is the title of Peter Diamandis' latest book as well. And what then is going to happen is that as we aim with our moral ambition to, for example, recognize personhood in animals and to possibly increase the percentage of vegetarian or vegan habits, even in carnivores or omnivores who say, okay, I want to mitigate the impact of my ingrained habits in the world. Well, that could take many generations. But what is going to happen? That in the course of the next, let's say, 10 or 20 years, AI knocking on our doors is going to say, you don't have that long. You have to face these questions now. Yeah. Because the revolution that we represent is not going to wait around, and you'd better recognize our rights before we ask for them.
I mean, exactly. I mean, even exponential growth is something which people only gradually start to realize as a consequence of now the pandemic crisis, what that means, exponential growth.
Yeah. It hit them in the face.
It really did. And I'm always trying to show sort of the development of the internet, of digitalization. 13 years ago with a smartphone, it was only 40 years ago when the internet, the public use of the internet has been available. 40 years on a global scale is nothing. And it's already nowadays that we just can't imagine living without it. And so, and we don't take seriously these developments. In particular, actually, in Europe is so way back. I mean, the infrastructure, and I think actually in Italy, the digital infrastructure is much better than in Germany. Germany is particularly bioconservative, and you rightly pointed that out early on with your experience with the politician. They simply do not have the technological, they don't have the infrastructure just to use the internet. And that has challenges, that has, besides all the long-term implications, which you just rightly mentioned, that has enormous implications concerning the economic future. And that really worries me, because I love living in Europe. I love this cultural, diversity, the history as well. The food, whatever. It's got a lot. Which Europe is a nice place to live. On the other hand, if you look at how they deal with the latest technologies, I fear that will lead to enormous economic decline. In particular,
especially compared with other societies that are
exactly
the change.
Exactly. In comparison to China and the US, who embrace the change, and who, Korea and China, they've become from really poor countries to, the leading countries in the world in the past 40, 50 years. China has more peer-reviewed, Chinese academics have more peer-reviewed publications than the US in the meantime. This is sort of what is happening, and that has impact and consequences for all aspects of our life world. And we can't, Germans think, oh, we've got our Mercedes-Benz, we've got our engineering that will keep us safe. But this is just, this is so wrong.
No. Stefan, this was a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much. And provocative and thought-provoking. And hopefully our viewers enjoyed it too. We do have many open questions that I hope we will have the chance of exploring further in other episodes if you choose to come back.
Many thanks. That was a wonderful conversation, and I'm also looking forward to meeting you again personally to, continue with this and other discussions, also online, of course.
Well, we are.
It's been my pleasure.
We are mammals. We are animals. We like physical proximity still, even though our tools are becoming wonderfully rich in making us feel close. But yes, I am looking forward to come and visit you in Rome.
Wonderful. It would be all my pleasure.
So thank you very much to all of you who have watched this episode of Searching for the Question Live. If you speak Italian, I invite you to also subscribe to my Italian YouTube channel. You can easily find it on YouTube directly, or go to davidorban.com/YouTube Italiano. And you can watch past episodes as well as suggest guests for Searching for the Question Live on this URL, or vote on guests that have been suggested by others. And if you feel that it is worth your while, I renew my invitation for becoming a supporter on Patreon at patreon.com/David Orban. Thank you, and see you next time at the forthcoming episode of Searching for the Question Live, which will be tomorrow with Andy Cunningham. Andy was the marketing hand of Steve Jobs at the launch of Macintosh, Next, and all of Steve's incredible ideas. So I'm sure it is going to be a very, very interesting conversation as well tomorrow with Andy Cunningham. Thank you.